Is pilot pay threatening to kill the future of electric and hydrogen-driven aircraft? Right now, there are a lot of companies working on aircraft with renewable power sources. So what type of obstacles are they facing, and is pilot salaries really one of them? Stay tuned. For several years now, there's been a huge interest in figuring out how to decarbonize aviation. Of course, this is because people are becoming more and more aware of the impact that aviation has on our planet. But it's not like nothing is being done. Aircraft and engine manufacturers are actually working hard on these very issues. In several of my videos, I've been explaining how much the efficiency of jet engines has improved over the last few decades and how it still continues to improve with each and every new aircraft generation. With projects like the CFM Rise on the horizon, these improvements also look set to continue when and if it actually enters into service, that is. But a lot of people feel that even if this design and other airframe tweaks could reduce emissions by, let's say, 20% or slightly more, that still just isn't enough. And that brings us to alternative renewable means of propulsion like hydrogen-powered, hybrid electric or battery electric aircraft. And as regular viewers of this channel will know, I recently visited a flight school in Sweden called Green Flight Academy, which is awesome by the way, where they actually do use small electric aircraft for training. This is the Pipistrel Velis Electro, which is already certified in Europe. And I just loved flying that thing. It was so much fun and it was so simple to use, so simple in fact that it only needed 4 buttons to get it up and running. This is such a toy. It's such a beautiful little aircraft. When it comes to teaching basic stick and rudder skills to new students, this plane works like any other basic trainer. But at the moment, it can only be practically used for around 45 minutes with typical VFR reserves. And that's quite limiting. But again, for a flight school, there is definitely a lot to like about an aircraft like this. Not only for environmental reasons, but also when it comes to cost. The flight that I took lasted around 40 minutes, and in terms of fuel or energy consumption, this flight only cost about €1 to do, which is about $1.10. Alright, I know that it's not that simple, because there are obviously other costs involved here as well, but even if you factor in the cost of replacing the battery packs every 500 hours and you spread this and all other maintenance and other costs into this, the Electros still cost about half as much as a similar plane with a conventional piston engine per hour. These electric planes also have fewer moving parts, so it should in theory be more reliable. But to be honest, this plane could really use batteries with a bit more capacity, which Pipistrel and its suppliers are very busy working on. But the very marginal range of even a small 2-seat trainer like this one shows how challenging this technology would be when scaling it up to something that would be able to carry passengers, even for short journeys. This really isn't easy, and if you have a look around the industry, it shows. During last year's Paris Air Show, renewable energy aviation projects were still very much on display, but unlike previous shows, a lot of the hype that normally formed part of these projects was now more, let's say, subdued. A few weeks before the air show, Tecnam decided to actually postpone their P-Volt battery electric program, and Tecnam, if you don't know who they are, isn't a startup at all. They are an established maker of single and twin piston engine aircraft who therefore knows how to design and build and also certify aircraft. So their decision to basically freeze their electric aircraft program indefinitely got a lot of attention. The company's announcement stated that available technologies, primarily around the energy density and other characteristics of batteries, just simply aren't there yet. And while some emerging battery tech looks promising, these batteries don't yet have the necessary endurance or the lifetime, as Tecnam explained in their really quite lengthy and technical announcement. These news and the less electric atmosphere at the Paris Air Show were followed just days later by another, very similar story, but this time from NASA. NASA stated that they would end their own battery electric test project, the X-57 Maxwell, in September of 2023. This meant that this aircraft, which also was made by Tecnam by the way, would not even fly once on electric power. Now, I don't want to sound pessimistic or defeatist here. NASA and Tecnam still learned a lot from those projects, and this knowledge will be really valuable when they do have everything they need in order to make this happen. NASA's work will, for example, help the FAA establish certification criteria for any upcoming electric aircraft. And there are companies out there who are still testing newer designs with lightweight, all-composite airframes that might be closer to making at least a 9-seat all-electric aircraft a reality. But as I've explained in previous videos, the problem with all battery electric designs is currently how to actually scale them. Conventional aircraft, who burn fuel and therefore get lighter during flight, get better and better efficiency per passenger as the plane design gets bigger. But that's not the same with batteries, whose weight obviously doesn't change over the flight, but still needs bigger and heavier batteries if it is to carry more people. Because of this, battery electric planes actually get harder and harder to realize as they become bigger. And again, the endurance of that electric trainer that I flew with only 2 of us on board is right now only good enough for local training flights. But like I said, there still are several battery electric aircraft projects out there, so because of what I just explained, most of them tend to limit their capacity to under 20 passengers. Now, there are also hybrid electric designs who push this passenger capacity a bit higher to around 30 to 35 passengers. And remember these passenger capacities, because they will become very important here soon. But what about other technologies, like hydrogen propulsion, for example, and how do pilot salaries come into all of this? Well, I've explained all of that, plus whether or not pilotless aircraft might play a role here after this. Hydrogen aircraft might well be the key to bringing aviation into a more sustainable future, but do you know what can make your online presence more sustainable? Today's sponsor, Incogni. Incogni is a great tool for protecting your online privacy, shielding you against scams, online harassment, and identity theft. They work by searching the internet for where your name and data are being sold by data brokers and then asking them to just remove this data from their services. Now, I know it's crazy that it's even legal to sell that, but this also means that you can do something about it, and Incogni will take care of everything for you, as well as keep monitoring compliance for as long as you stay subscribed. As part of my sponsor vetting, which I always do, I tried Incogni out and I was really impressed with what I saw. They quickly identified 65 different data brokers who were selling my data and has, as of now, removed 62 of those, with 3 still in progress. This has led to way less spam in my inbox, as well as less robocalls and other nuisance. So if washing the internet free of your personal data sounds interesting, well then use the link here below, which is incogni.com/mentornow, and use the code MENTORNOW to get started with a 60% discount. Thank you, Incogni. Now let's continue. Nice. Anyway, Airbus first announced their Zero E project back in September of 2020. Zero E stands for Zero Emission, and it's Airbus's hydrogen propulsion project. Now, as part of this project, they have published various renderings of the different forms that these designs could potentially take, depending on a few different factors. You see, it isn't possible to simply take an existing airliner design and just run it on hydrogen, at least not without some serious modifications. And that's because we can't really store hydrogen inside an aircraft wings as we do with jet fuel, because hydrogen needs to be stored at extremely low cryogenic temperatures, and that's right now done easiest in a near spherical container. The reason for that is that hydrogen is extremely difficult to keep contained under pressure as a gas. It is much easier to cool it down into a liquid, even though this means getting it down to minus 253 degrees Celsius or minus 423 degrees Fahrenheit. And then, obviously, they also have to then keep it at that temperature. For quite some time now, liquid hydrogen has been used as rocket fuel, powering the Space Shuttle and the Ariane 5 rocket, for example. And this means that the aerospace industry actually has plenty of experience in handling hydrogen, including moving it around in fuel systems at very low temperatures. But making this work on commercial planes still involves a lot of innovation. For example, we need to find out ways to handling this hydrogen safely inside systems that would be reused consistently, unlike single-use space rockets are today. Anyway, all this means is that this type of fuel will need to be stored inside of the aircraft's fuselage, which presents quite a few different challenges. But it could also be an opportunity to try some new ideas, like a blended wing body design, for example, which you can actually see in some of the renderings that Airbus published. Now, in general, as I explained in detail in previous videos, there are two different ways for an airliner to get propulsion out of hydrogen, and the method that Airbus will select for their first project could have a big impact on the topic of this video. You see, one way to use hydrogen in an aircraft is to use existing turbofan and turboprop engines and just simply burn the hydrogen inside of them instead of jet fuel. This is the simpler method, relatively speaking, but it still involves modifying the engines to work at higher temperatures, and obviously there is also that small matter of figuring out how to store and then handle the fuel. But the other way is to use hydrogen to create electricity in a fuel cell. If that's done, well, then this electricity could be used to drive electric motors, driving the propellers to then generate the thrust. In the right conditions, this setup is actually considerably more efficient than using hydrogen combustion. But the problem is that this method, the fuel cell, is technologically even more complicated. And crucially, it's also heavier, and that means that it will be much more difficult to scale up a hydrogen fuel cell setup to power a really big aircraft. Airbus is testing the more complex fuel cell setup on the ground in what they call an iron pod, which is basically a big rig that simulates all of the complicated systems of an aircraft. But they will also test both of these setups in the air in a modified Airbus A380, actually the first Airbus A380 ever produced. This plane is already being modified to have a fifth test engine on a pylon high up on the rear half of the fuselage, which looks quite funky, but I kind of like it. One round of this testing will involve a hydrogen fuel cell, electric motor and a propeller. And for hydrogen combustion testing, Airbus will use a General Electric Passport engine taken from a business jet. This flight testing will begin towards the end of 2026, and shortly after that Airbus will need to make that decision about which system they will actually go with, hydrogen fuel cell or hydrogen combustion. And that decision will define the size and role of its first ever hydrogen airliner. This is finally where pilot pay comes into the equation. So far, we've only really been looking at these designs in terms of their feasibility from a technical standpoint. And while that is obviously a really big hurdle, there are also quite a few operational and economical realities that we also need to look into. I have previously explained that for airlines, the main factor that determines their profitability is the cost of fuel. But there are also other costs to consider, like maintenance, airport and airways fees, and of course the cost of pilots and cabin crew. After the worst of the pandemic was over, a lack of pilots have now meant that the pilots' salaries have started going up in quite a lot of places, especially in the United States, which is the world's most important aviation market. This trend was especially true for pilots in the regional carriers, whose salaries have now thankfully gone up considerably. But since this lower original pay of those regional pilots was a big part of why regionals existed in the first place, I previously predicted that the US regionals might soon actually cease to exist, at least as separate entities. Now, that hasn't quite happened yet, but something that has happened is that the US regionals today are becoming less and less regional because their aircrafts keep getting bigger. The rules between the airlines vary slightly, but in general there are two categories of regional aircraft. Those with 50 seats, for example the CRJ's 200s, and those with 76 seats, which are the likes of the CRJ 700s or Embraer 175s. In recent years, the 50-seat CRJ 200 have been slowly phased out, and some of them are being replaced by CRJ 550s, which are basically CRJ 700s with fewer seats. But increasingly, the airlines are actually relying more on their 76-seater E175s. Now, this really isn't that surprising because, as I mentioned earlier, with conventional aircraft, efficiency improves when the size goes up. And the same is true about a lot of the running costs, including the costs to pay the crew. So in other words, when crew salaries are going up, the economics of smaller aircraft becomes worse. And I think you can maybe start to see where I'm getting at with this. Given this fact, the industry might not be that keen on adapting smaller aircraft like battery electric and hybrids with around 20 to 30 seats, where they still have to pay those two quite expensive pilots. On the operational side, it is also likely that at least the first small battery electric and hybrid electric aircraft won't necessarily have much spare range on top of the minimum legal reserves that they'll have to have. And that means that it is likely that the airlines operating those planes will need to cancel more flights if weather or other factors aren't favorable, which of course in itself is a really costly process for an airline. And that's when we make an apples to apples comparison between, let's say, an electric 20-seater and a conventional 20-seater performing the same route. Björn Färm looked at these problems in great detail in a recent series that he did over on Leham News, which, by the way, if you haven't checked out, you really should. I will link to them below. What he pointed out was that things actually get a lot worse if we try replacing, let's say, a 50-seat jet with 2 smaller electric planes or one 76-seater with 3 of those planes. That just doesn't make a lot of sense, neither economically or operationally, since it would mean the same operational constraints plus 2 or 3 times the number of pricey pilots to do the same thing. Now, I'm not saying that these aircraft won't have any advantages on certain routes when they become operational, but my guess is that these might be on new types of routes that current aircraft aren't even serving today. Maybe that will be on remote parts of countries which need a lot of short routes over rough terrain or water, like in New Zealand or up in northern Sweden. But if that happens, these new type of routes would mean a growth to the existing airline industry, which would of course also increase the need for pilots. So since the reason that pilot pay right now is going up has to do with the already existing pilot shortage, this might just cause the airlines to be even less interested in adopting this technology. There are also more costs like airport and other fees which might not favor a bigger fleet of smaller aircraft, although I think it's probably highly likely that a lot of governments and authorities will waive or drastically reduce these costs to help these type of projects get off the ground. To be perfectly honest, I actually think that government subsidies will be absolutely crucial if we are to ever see any of these projects succeed. But that's battery and hybrid electric aircraft. What about hydrogen? Well, if Airbus is working on concepts that will be able to carry between 100 and 200 passengers and also fly up to 1,000 or 2,000 nautical miles, well then the scale of the problem is completely different with them. A 200-seat airliner, or really anything between around 160 and 200 seat, could basically fulfill most of the roles of the current middle-of-the-market aircraft, like the Boeing 737 and Airbus A320 families. Now, of course, the 737s and the Airbus A320s have quite a bit more range than that, around 3,000 nautical miles normally, depending on which model we're talking about. But for a first hydrogen airliner, something with a 2,000 mile range will definitely fit the game. And in the context of this video, such an aircraft could well be a one-for-one replacement of current conventional aircraft, which means that they shouldn't be adversely affected by whatever happens to, for example, pilot salaries. At least in theory, that is. In practice, the definition of what constitutes a middle-of-the-market aircraft seems to be constantly growing, again, for the very same efficiency reasons that I talked about before. But not all routes need an all-economy 240-seat Airbus A321neo, as some airlines have actually discovered recently. Now, of course, we still don't know what decision Airbus will take regarding the type of hydrogen propulsion that they will use, and with that, the possible size of their first hydrogen aircraft. It could end up being much closer to a 100-seat capacity, and if it gets much smaller than that, well, then they will face that same type of problem as the battery and hybrid electric aircraft do. But, of course, there are also other challenges here, like the fact that only a few dozen airports will probably have proper hydrogen infrastructure to begin with, and that is an issue that, again, will need heavy governmental support in order to be overcome. Also, in this video I have mainly focused on what Airbus is doing with hydrogen. There are other companies out there like ZeroAvia or Universal Hydrogen who are working on processes that would retrofit hydrogen fuel cell engines to a 70-seat turboprop like the ATR-72 or the Q400. The hydrogen tanks will reduce the seat capacity of these aircraft quite a lot, which could again make them become a little bit more sensitive to things like pilot salaries. But finally, what about autonomous aircraft, pilotless aircraft? Is there a chance that companies might develop single pilot or even pilotless airliners to get around the lack of pilots, especially for small electric aircraft? Well, I personally think that this is highly unlikely. I know that some eVTOL designs are moving towards that direction, but those vehicles will probably operate out of heliports and other dedicated sites, and likely only on predetermined routes. I don't think that we are anywhere close to autonomous operations from regular airports alongside with existing aircraft, at least not for now and at least not for a very long time yet. But reduced crew operations are being discussed for long-haul flights that currently requires 3 or 4 pilots who take turns resting. These operations are being discussed only for the cruise phase of very long flights, so it doesn't really apply to the type of routes and technologies that I've covered today. But what do you think? Can you think of another cost that could limit the potential of alternative aircraft propulsion? Or is there a new aircraft project out there that you think that I should be covering on this channel? Let me know in the comments below and leave a like when you're down there. Also, consider supporting me by supporting my sponsor, and if you want to really get involved in the channels, well then use the link here below or somewhere here on the screen to join my awesome Patreon crew. It's soon time for another hangout. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.